and a fine art printing workflow. So what I want to talk about is exactly what part the printer plays in all of this and where all of the little steps and nuances matter. It's very important to keep in mind one critical fact, which is the printer is a default device. And what that means is it's only as good as the things that you send it. So 95% of a printing workflow is all of the things that you are going to do before you hit Command or Control P. And the more you understand how everything works, how everything mixes, and how everything interacts, the better your prints will ultimately be. And my belief is that the print is the thing that will outlive me. And the images that take me, that go through the entire workflow to be outputted, are the ones that will survive me. And they're the best of the moments of my life that I share. So if they're the best of me, the best of my experience on the planet, I should take every ounce, gram, milligram of care that one can take to make the best possible print. And so the more you understand how the middle part of it works, what you need to do and how you need to do it, the better informed your decisions can be at the beginning when you are taken by the picture and you plunge the shutter down, because all those considerations that you're making at point of capture are in service of the print, and the print will always be in service of your voice. Now, the way I was taught color is that he who controls color in an image wins. And when you're in a digital workflow, be it a full spectrum color or a chromatic grayscale or black and white image, you are working with color. Equal values of red, green, and blue create gray, and different values of red, green, and blue create color. Now, with that as the underlying understanding of printing, what we need to do is understand what it is that we're working on, what it is that we're in, and what it is that our images are about. So let's take a look at a simple diagram my friend Gordon Brown made. Now, this is a simple way to remember things. sRGB is simply for the internet. This is sRGB, this triangle here. This here is the extent of human vision, or the lab color space. And this is Adobe RGB. Now, as you can see, sRGB is considerably smaller than Adobe RGB, and the color extent of human vision is bigger than any of those color spaces. Now, these triangles are all well and good, and this is a good thing to keep in mind, but let's take a look at something that will be a little bit better understanding of what the color spaces actually are and what it is that's actually going on, and why printer profiling matters, and why monitor calibration matters. Now, one of the things that I travel with is I travel with the Color Monkey photo in the field, and I can make profiles in the field when I have to work, because a printer-specific profile is better than a generic profile, or a profile that's meant to cover many, many, many printers, which we'll take a look at in one sec. So this is sRGB. This is the color space of the internet. It was designed to maximize skin tone on a monitor. So that's all the color that sRGB can contain. This is Adobe RGB, and as you can see, Adobe RGB is considerably bigger than sRGB, even though it does share at one point almost the exact same values here in the tri-stimulus values of red, green, and blue. But as you can see here, out in the greens and in the yellows, it exceeds what sRGB can do. This is ProPhoto RGB, which is pretty damn big. And as you can see, it eclipses sRGB and Adobe RGB. So in a fine art printing workflow, the first thing that you want to do is you want to work in ProPhoto RGB, and you want to work in 16-bit instead of 8-bit. So ProPhoto RGB 16-bit. The reason for that is that this gives you the most amount of room to move, and it minimizes artifact. Now, if you only get one thing out of this discussion, please get this. All artifacting is cumulative and may be multiplicative. And the goal is to negate multiplication artifacting and to minimize accumulation artifacting. So what exactly does that mean? Okay, let's take a look at this image right here. So this is a photograph that I took. Come on, I'm having a finicky computer today. In which, if you notice, this picture's out of focus. Now, this is a technique that I've developed for bringing an out-of-focus photograph back into focus. And the reason why this is occurring is that there is mist in the air, and it's causing a diffusion on the image. So this is the before, and this is after I run 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different types of sharpening. Now, what you should notice is that each one of these is on a different layer. Now, the reason why each one of these is on a different layer has to do with all artifacting is cumulative and may be multiplicative. So if we look at the individual steps, this is tightening up the image, and as you can see, what happens when I'm all done, this image is now in focus. And what it is that I'm tightening up the edges of the image and making them more coherent so that they give you the illusion of in focus. So this is before, this is after. Now, this is going to be all of the sharpenings that I did applied to one layer. This is multiplication artifacting, which is not something you want to do. It's not that I'm layer happy. It's that what I'm trying to do is to negate this type of artifacting. So what you're seeing is that as we look at these individual layers, if I combine these two, there will be accumulation of a 2%, let's say, quality decrease, and this is a 3% quality decrease. 3 plus 2 is 5, times 3 is 15. So this has another 3% quality decrease. 3 plus 15 is 18 times 3, and so on and so on and so on. And what occurs is you get this. So in your workflow, the goal is to negate multiplication artifacting and to minimize accumulation artifacting. So you can do things like sharpen an image 6 times at the very beginning. And the reason why I can do that is because I have a good understanding of the way in which the middle part works. So one of the things that you want to consider in a fine art workflow is that you're going to live in the world of 2%. And 2% means that if it gives you a 2% quality increase, you're going to do it. Now, let's take a look at another image. This is a black and white image, a chromatic grayscale image, and this is using a concept called film and filter, which was developed by Russell Brown. Russell Brown is one of the originators of Photoshop. He's very, very intricately involved. This particular technique is absolutely brilliant in what it is that it does. But to be able to make a great chromatic grayscale image, you have to first start with a great color image. So let's start with this color image right here. So the first thing, as you can see, is that this image needs to be retouched. So before I even go to chromatic grayscale, I have to make this a perfect color image. So what I'm going to do here is repair all of the skin. So as you can see, these are all of the retouch steps that I went through to get this image here. Now that I have good skin tone, what I'm going to start to do is aesthetic corrections. Now the aesthetic corrections are warm up the image, because warm colors move forward in an image, cool colors recede. And as you can see, simply by warming her up, what occurs is Shaolin moves forward and the background recedes backward, because the shadows are cooler than the lit area, which is warmer, which gives the illusion of moving forward. Now I'm going to sit here and enhance detail in her eyes, as you can see right here. I'm going to add tonal contrast to bring more depth into the eyes, and then here I'm going to do my aesthetic corrections for moving your eye through the picture, which is using Vivesa, the Nik software owned by Google. So it's the Nik software given to you by Google. This software is free, which is my favorite four-letter word. Now that we're looking at that, here are the detail adjustments to the image to bring out more depth and detail into the eye. So what I can do is I can control where your eye goes. The way the eye works is it goes to patterns that it recognizes first, from light to dark. So what I want to have happen is I want your eyes to go here, then here. I'm giving you an area of retreat, which is this area here, which is smoother, bigger planes, more out of focus, because the eye basically doesn't really want to look at anything. It's always in a seek mode. And since it's in a seek mode, what I want it to do is I want to have an area that will attract the eye, patterns that it recognizes first, light to dark, high contrast to low contrast, high sharpness to low sharpness, which is different than in focus to blur. And sharpness is the introduction to contrast to the edges of pixels. High saturation of color to low saturation of color. Warm colors move forward, cool colors recede. So that's the biomechanics of human vision, and that is what controls the way your eye works. And when it comes to a print, the goal of a print is to control how the eye moves through the image. Because what you want to do to a photograph, to an image, you want to create an image that when it's on the wall, you can't stop looking at it. That the viewer has to look at the eye or at the picture and is compelled to look at your image. The reason for that is a simple one. We'll get to my favorite quote of Oscar Wilde's, which amateurs speak in terms of art, artists speak in terms of money. My goal is to sell images. The way in which I sell images is creating images in which you can't stop looking at them. I am fully aware of the fact that what I am doing is manipulating the viewer. It's my image. My job is to simply do that, is to create an image in which you have to look at it. And the more you have to look at it, the higher likelihood you have of somebody buying it. And that's the goal for me in a fine art workflow, is I make a living selling art. And so what I do is I pay attention to learning about how the eye works. Now, where does color management come in this? Because I have a color managed monitor calibrated, I can make informed decisions about the color of this image. Let's take a look at monitor profiles. Let's get out of here and let's go back to here. So these are the different color spaces. This is my Adobe RGB, 98% of Adobe RGB monitor. And let's just tone that down. And this is Adobe RGB. So what you can see here is that my monitor does not give me 100% of Adobe RGB, but it gets me pretty darn close. So I want to work in a monitor that's calibrated, that's as close to the color space that I can print in. But herein lies an issue. I have a printer that can exceed Adobe RGB. So if we look at a profile for the 7900 for Epson Legacy Platine, what you can see here is that I have the capability of making an image in which has more color than Adobe RGB can contain, see over here, and my monitor can see. this potentially can be a problem for me. Where this problem is in skin tones. You have to look at what are the images, the characteristics of the images that you're working with, and what it is that you're trying to accomplish with your image. If what you're trying to do is to get color accuracy in skin tone, you don't necessarily want to print out of ProPhoto RGB. And the reason being is I can print, as you can see here, more color than the monitor can see and more color than Adobe RGB contains. So let's take a look at 3 images. Let's look at, well, actually, I'm a liar. Let's take a look at 4 images. 3 images. I'm not a liar. Let's look at these 3 images. We're going to look at one in Adobe RGB, this one here, one in ProPhoto RGB, and one in sRGB. All right, let us just minimize this one for a second. All right, so what I'm going to ask you is, this is ProPhoto RGB, and this is sRGB. Do you see a difference on the screen in the color of the skin tone? Most assuredly, no. And the reason being is that the monitor contains all of the colors of the skin tone in its color space. This is Adobe RGB. Of these 3 faces, there is no noticeable difference between the color of these 3 faces. However, let's take a look. Oh, show up. At sRGB. And let's turn off for a second. This is all the color in the image in sRGB. So let's take a look at the sRGB color space. As you can see, sRGB contains all of the color that this image contains. But if I go from sRGB to Adobe RGB, what you can see, get over here, is that there is color outside of sRGB, which means that I have more color in the oranges and yellows than sRGB can contain. So that means that if I were to print this, what I would wind up having is I would have a more orangey yellow skin tone if I was working in the sRGB color space. Let's take a look at the ProPhoto version of this image. Here we go. Now, if we look at the ProPhoto version of this image, I have a real problem. What would happen here is I would see normal skin tone, but I have colors that exceed normal skin tone. So let's look at Adobe RGB. Let's turn sRGB off. So with my ProPhoto photograph, if we look here in ColorThink, what I have is I have colors that fall outside of Adobe RGB. I can see it. I've made decisions based on the monitor and all of that. But the problem here is that I have a profile. Let's take a look at my profile that can print colors bigger than Adobe RGB. So the problem here is I'm going to wind up with having a yellowish skin cast to an image in which looks like normal skin tone. So I make a decision based on my monitor, but the problem is I have a printer that can print more colors than both Adobe RGB can contain and my monitor can see. So with regard to skin tone, what I always do, 100% of the time, is that I will then go to, in Photoshop, Image, Convert to Profile, which will bring this Convert to Profile dialog box up eventually. I have a finicky computer today that needs a little system maintenance love. And I will select Adobe RGB, always making sure that I'm in the relative colorimetric rendering intent and always making sure that I use black point compensation. Wherever you see black point compensation, you always want to check that box. The reason for this is that different papers have different black points. So when it comes to working on an image, you want to be able to get all of the detail in the black areas. Let's get out of that because I don't need to convert that. So let me show you what that means. So see these areas right here? Let's say that I have detail in the lab count or the L-star count at 3. That means at an L-star count, a luminance count of 3, I have detail. But my paper, based on the profiling and based on the type of paper it is, for example, let's use Velvet Fine Art. That doesn't start showing detail in the blacks until an L-star count of 11. What that means is, and I'm just making that number up, I'm not sure exactly what it is, I just know that it doesn't start at 3. What that would mean in theory is that between 3 and 11, I would lose all of that detail. I wouldn't start seeing detail until 11. What black point compensation does is it says, I have detail from 3 to 11. I'm going to move the detail from 3 in the black and start that at an L-star count of 11. So it puts all of the detail back into the image. How that would manifest in a print is that the print would be without black point compensation. This would just be one giant black splotch. With black point compensation, you would have all of the detail that is in this image, in those dark areas. So wherever you see black point compensation, it is important that you make sure that what you do is you select it. Now, one of the things that you can do is called soft proofing. Now, soft proofing, again, give me a moment because my computer's being a little finicky today, is I can select all of the profiles that I have loaded in my camera. Now, what this is called is profile-itis, which is because I have so many different printers and do so many different things, I wind up with way too many profiles. But what I can do is I can come in here and I can select the profile. I can simulate the paper color. We call this the ugly button because it always makes it look ugly. And I'm going to select relative colorimetric black point compensation. So what you can see here is using Epson Legacy Platine, what will occur is I will get a, and this is using the Color Monkey photo on a P800. So this is me taking this image, or taking an image and applying a image-specific profile to it. If we take a look at this, you see what changed here, how the paper, the profile, the image on the screen got flatter. That's replicating what Epson Velvet Fine Art would look like. If I look at the 3880, that changes. If I come up here, come on, there we go. Let's take a look at where are you? Premium glossy. You see how all of a sudden the color changed? Now, what's good about doing this is you can now see what it is that the paper will look like on the monitor. The only way that you can do this is if the monitor is calibrated. So let me show you a little technique that I learned from a good friend of mine, John Paul Caponegro. So let's duplicate this image. And I'm going to put this over here. And what I'm going to do is put them side by side. And I'm going to go to View, Proof Setup, Custom. Give it a second. There we go. And I'm going to pick a profile to work on. Let's pick Velvet Fine Art paper. Simulate paper. Okay. So you see the difference between these two? This is a bit flatter and I've lost some saturation. What I can do is I can come here and let's go to Hue Saturation. Oops, wrong one, sorry. Let's go to here and go to Hue Saturation. Let's try this one more time. And what I can do is I can increase the saturation to match the color. I can adjust the hue. So I've boosted the saturation a little bit. And with the gradient map, or the gradient tool rather, holding the Shift key down, I can create a gradient. And what I can do is, looking at this one, come in and find, oops, sorry, with the sampler tool, where it is that I want this to be. Let's say here. And if you notice over here, it became that gray. So what I can do is I can find the compensation that I want that matches this, and then what I can then do is come in and fill that layer with the appropriate amount of compensation so that I can get a more balanced look to the picture. This is something you can only do if you calibrate the monitor. So what you can do here is you can do something called soft proofing. To recap, is that I'm going to can load in the profile of the paper that I want to replicate, and then I'm going to look at the copy of the file in which I've made all the decisions on, and I'm going to try and get the paper that I want to print and the file that I worked on to match. And how I do that is I will make a duplicate of the file so that I can look at it, and then I will make the decisions on this file for my printer corrections, so that what I will wind up with is I will wind up with an image that has the perfect balance, or as close to matching that picture as I can get. Again, that requires that I have a calibrated monitor. When I used to host the Epson Print Academy, the first thing I would say after introducing myself was, if you don't own a calibrator, and if you don't calibrate your monitor, buy a calibrator. The single greatest impact that you can have on your prints is to calibrate your monitor, because the monitor is the window to the image, and you want to make sure that when you're looking at the image, what you're producing is the best possible image that will make the best possible print. So let's take a look at the difference in printers. So this is the P600. This is the 9000. Now the 9000 and 5000 introduce a different color, two different colors, orange and green. And as you can see, that the 9000 has a greater color gamut than the 600. So if what you're looking for is more colorful images, you'd want to consider something like a P5000 printer. The reason being is because of the orange green ink set. If you're doing a lot of black and white printing, all the printers with the new black inks produce wonderful, spectacular chromatic grayscale images. Now, when would I use ProPhoto Color Space? When would I use ProPhoto Color Space? I would use it for, let's go to printing something like this image. Or printing something like this image. And the reason why that is that these colors cooperate. Is that these colors are not necessarily reality, in the sense that sunsets tend to be more color than color. So the colors have been pushed a little bit to replicate what it is that I remembered when I looked at the image. So with regard to images that have fantasy colors, I'm going to use ProPhoto RGB because I want all of the color that I can get, and I want all of the color that the color space that the profile can provide, and I want to squeeze all of the color out of the printer that I can get. So that I'm going to make a decision based on the image as to whether or not I am going to use ProPhoto or Adobe RGB or even sRGB. There are instances where I would consider sRGB as a color space. For example, if I'm doing skin tone, that I have to make sure that I maximize the skin tone. Now, a big question that I frequently get is, how do you know if an image is meant to be a black and white? Do you see in black and white? So let's take a look at that. Equal values of red, green, and blue produce gray. This is not near as interesting an image as this. So I would probably not make this into a black and white image. The reason why is that the color is what is important of this image. However, when would I? Let's get back over here. This image was never, ever, ever, ever going to be a color image. To me, the vision of this image is always a black and white image. And the reason being is that the color gets in the way of the gesture of the image. What that means is that the patterns and shapes are being diminished somewhat by the intensity of the color. Now, herein lies the rub. To be able to make this beautiful black and white image that I want to make, I have to have this color image to start with. So let's take a look at looking at all of the film and filter techniques that were done to this image. And let me turn this off so you don't see this just yet. All right, so this is the final image. So these are all the steps that were done to adjust this image to produce a color image that gave me my black and white image. And let me show you exactly what that looks like step by step. Alrighty. Okay, so this is a chromatic grayscale image. So first off, as you can see, I've changed the color contrast, and as I do these individual steps, what I am doing is removing all of the color that distracts from the image to produce this black and white image. So the first question I get is, do you see the image in color? That would be the color that I would have to see to be able to produce this black and white image. So the answer is no, I do not see the image in black and white. I see the image in color. What I do is I make decisions about the image based on color, and which is very, very important. That the controlling the color of the image is what determines the quality of the chromatic grayscale. Now, there's a few little other adjustments here to this image. Let's put this up here, where what I'm going to finalize the image is I'm going to buff the image using the red filter and blue filters in Photoshop to produce the best possible image. It is a collision between red, green, and blue that determines the quality of the chromatic grayscale image that I'm going to get. I'm working in an RGB environment, which means that I want to be able to control the individual red, green, and blue channels. So all of my considerations about this image were first to produce the best color image, so that what I could do is wind up with a chromatic grayscale image in which this would be the color, if I saw color that way, it would be. So you have to have a great color image to be able to produce a great black and white image. And if color management matters anywhere, it matters most here. Let's do a simple, and I've done this example before, but it bears being repeated. Let's start with equal values of red, green, and blue, which produces a medium gray, which will give me a chromatic grayscale image. If all I do is move this green 3 points, what happens to this image? That's gray. That's not gray. It's a neutral green, but it's still not gray. Here's the thing. We never know what color is what color unless we have a calibrated monitor. We just know that a red is a red. We don't know if it's a specific red, but we sure know if gray is gray. So with an uncalibrated monitor, I may be making decisions on an image that will make the image look gray, but what's going to happen is I'm going to correct the monitor on the screen to look right on the monitor, and when I print it, remember what we said, the printer is a default device. When I send the file to the printer, what will occur is I will get the correction curve that I have made on the monitor to make it look right on the monitor. So I will print my corrections. If I have a calibrated monitor, and if I use printer-specific profiles, what I can do is I can have the entire chain be dialed in, and that the decisions that I make on the monitor will be reflected in the image that I output. And since the negative may be everything, the print is all. The negative is the sheet music, but the print, the final print, is a symphony. And it is that, the print itself, that reflects what it is that I want to say as a visual artist. It is the print that will be the thing that moves the viewer. It is the print that is the symphony. It is the state of the art of my work, and it is the best that I can possibly do. So the most amount of considerations I want to make at point of capture all involve how I'm going to build a print. So I'm going to have a calibrated monitor. I'm going to use proper paper profiling, which is hard to say fast. Let me show you a little technique. The last thing that I do to an image before I print it is something that was developed by a gentleman named Mac Holbert called Midtone Contrast. I call it midtone contouring because I do one thing different than Mac does. But what that is, and I'll show you it right here, is simply this. I'm going to run this action, and what I'm going to get is a large radius, low opacity, high pass sharpening that will be targeted specifically to the midtones. So as you can see here, it doesn't do anything to the darks. It starts to ramp at 50. When it hits 70, it goes to 100%, and when it hits 185, it then diminishes to 205. And what this does is that it tightens up the image for printing, so that the difference here is that it just targets the midtone structures, and I build a layer mask in here so that if I don't want to target the background, so let's fill this in. So let's say that what I want to do is I want a blurry background. I don't need to sharpen the background, and this doesn't need to be sharpened. So what I can do is I can come here at 100% because I want the eyes, and I want the lips at 100%, and then I'm going to go to 50%. Command-Shift-F will bring the fade, whatever it is I just did, dialog box, or Control-Shift-F. So I can go to 100% or I can go to 0, and I can dial in exactly what the percentage is that I want. So in this instance, it's 67%. And all we're going to do here to make this action is you set the action to create a new layer, set the current layer to an opacity of 30%, desaturate the layer, and make a high pass filter layer of 50 pixels. So if we were to do this manually, I would Command J, Command or Control U, which brings up hue saturation, and I would desaturate the image. The reason why I'm going to do that, and I would set it to the overlay blend mode, the reason why I'm going to desaturate the image is I don't want to sharpen the color. I'm then going to go to unsharpen mask, or excuse me, to sharpen. Oh, where'd you go? Am I a liar? I haven't done this in so long because I have it there we go, other, high pass. I'm going to set it to 50 pixels. Click OK. I'm going to Command click, move this to 50. Option click on the slider, move this to 70. Move this down to 185. Option or Alt click on this, and then move this to 205. Click OK. Then set this opacity to 30%. 100% of my images I do this to. This is the secret to my printing, that this is the very last thing that I do before I print. So these are the steps that I go through to make an image, and that the thing that I want to impress, that the printer's a default device, and it is the quality of the file that you send it that will make the best possible print. So what I'd like to do, if I may, is I'd like to open this up to some questions. First question, have I worked with Epson print layout software? Yes, I have. I have been the beta tester on that software for the last 3.5 years. It is the way in which that I would recommend printing. Now, what does Epson print layout software do? Epson print layout software, I'm going to find it in this. I wasn't planning on talking about it, but it seems like as good as time as any. Allows you to skip using Photoshop or Lightroom. You can go straight to the printer. The reason why Epson print layout software was developed was that the issue at hand is that operating systems and image editing software tend to change the way in which the communication between printer driver and file works. There's also situations where you don't need to open up Lightroom or Adobe Photoshop to be able to print. That would be the situation there would be when you just want to make a print. You don't need to open up an image editing software. What you can do is you can open up Epson Print Layout. Now what Epson Print Layout allows you to do is allows you to be able to select the printer, make presets, and then select the printer types, and then control the printer directly. You speak directly to the printer with Epson Print Layout. So the advantage here is that you will not have to go through the operating system per se or any of the image editing softwares, that you will be speaking directly to the printer. It's a much simpler workflow, specifically if all you have to do is print. I use Epson Print Layout 100% of the time when I print. No. Stephen asks, are you recommending in general not to work in ProPhoto, only in special case scenario? No, that is not at all what I'm recommending. I am recommending that 100% of the time you work in ProPhoto RGB. I am not recommending that 100% of the time you print in ProPhoto RGB. ProPhoto RGB is a working color space, and the reason why you want to work in ProPhoto RGB is to minimize artifacting. Because it's such a big color space, the artifacting that will occur in an image will occur outside of the printer's ability to print. You'll get better skin tone, better gradation than you would get in Adobe RGB or sRGB. I would recommend that you consider, with regard to printing people, specifically people of color, people from Asia, people that have a high red pigment in their skin tone, out of Adobe RGB. Also Caucasians. What can happen sometimes when you're printing is you can get something that we refer to as pig pink, where the color will be a little bit pinker than you'd want it to be, because the color space is bigger than the monitor can see, and the profile can produce more color than the monitor can see. With regards to sunsets, flowers, landscapes, all of that stuff, I print out of ProPhoto RGB. The reason being is I want the maximum amount of color. Now, with regards to, as Brent asked, would you ever work in ProPhoto RGB if your camera's largest color space is Adobe RGB? Your camera's largest color space is not Adobe RGB. The largest color space that you are allowed to select for the thumbnail and for JPEG is Adobe RGB. But a RAW file is a non-linearized black and white file that color is generated from, and it has red, green, and blue information in it from the Bayer array. The RAW file contains more color than Adobe RGB. The reason why you set your camera to Adobe RGB has to do for making a reasonable consideration or decision based off of the histogram on the back of the camera. With regards to something called exposed to the right. Exposed to the right means this, that 2/3 of the file's information is in the first stop of data. So you want to be able to make sure that you are maximizing the amount of data, and you want to be able to have a histogram on the back of the camera that is reasonably useful. If you look at a ProPhoto histogram in Adobe Photoshop versus an Adobe RGB histogram, you'll notice that there's far more color information and far more information in the ProPhoto histogram. So histograms on the back of the camera are not necessarily the most useful. They're helpful, but they're not giving you exactly what the whole truth of the image is. Okay, so let's see. I notice you, Alfonso from Mexico asks, I notice you generally or mostly use colorimetric rendering intent. I do not. I use, hold on, yes, I do. Wait. I use, make sure that I get this correct before I make this. Let's look at my color settings to make sure that I I don't use perceptual, I use relative colorimetric. I'm sorry, it was backwards. The reason why I use relative colorimetric instead of perceptual is that relative colorimetric gives me the most color volume. It's the least forgiving, but it gives me the most color volume. So I always set everything up for relative colorimetric because I want the most amount of color that I can possibly get. So the only time that I would ever consider, Alfonso, is using perceptual rendering intent is that if I have posterization, which is that I need to compress the colors into the color space. But if you set up your workflow, and if you look at it the way I have color settings set up here, ProPhoto RGB, preserve embedded profiles, and select all of these that tell me if something is not ProPhoto, and use black point compensation. Always set to a relative colorimetric, always use ACE, the Adobe Color Engine. That would be what it is that I would set up. So take a look at the screen grab. This is the way in which you should set up your color management preferences. The default is sRGB, but set this to ProPhoto RGB. Lauren asks, what's the name of the free program from Google? It's called the Nick Collection by Google. And Google gives you that for free. It used to be a $600 plugin made by Nick Software. Google is now generous since it purchased Nick Software, and it now gives it to you for free. That's Silver Effects, Color Effects Pro, Define, and all of those. Now that On1 has gone so far away from genuine fractals, are you using the newer iteration called On1 Resize? If not, how do you manage your files now? Kent asks. Perfect Resize is genuine fractals. They just renamed it. I do 100% of my scaling using genuine fractals, and I can show you if you would. Well, I have 4 minutes. I can't show you. The best way to scale up an image is to use Perfect Resize using genuine fractals algorithm. That is a fractal scaling algorithm. All it is a name change. Kent asks, where can we learn Mr. Versace's Lazarus effect? Well, eventually, sometime this year, I'm going to make that into a tutorial from Acme Educational. I have an older version of it. I'm going to update it because there are some things that have changed in Photoshop that I want to do, and the fact that I now have access to software that I can recommend that you use for free, which is the Nick Collection by Google. I would highly recommend, if you don't own that software, that you own that software. And since it is my favorite 4-letter word, free, I would suggest that. Stephen asks, what is the Russell Brown grayscale technique? It's called the film and filter approach, in which basically what you do is you create a hue saturation adjustment layer, desaturate that layer, call that film, set it to the color blend mode, and then beneath the layers, use hue saturation adjustment layers to correct the image using hue. And let me give you a quick show you of that. Let's get out of here. Let's go to, let's turn these off. What that is this. Simply put, if I create a hue and saturation layer and desaturate the image, I get a black and white image. Let's call this film. And what we're taught with regard to black and white is that color doesn't matter. Let's call this filter 1. And if I move the hue here, nothing happens, because we're looking at it from the top down. But if I put this in the color blend mode, and let's put filter underneath it, watch what happens to the image as I move hue around. You see how this changes? That by changing the hue underneath the desaturation layer, I can affect the color. And why that is images go from the bottom up, but we tend to perceive them from the top down. So color matters. And Russell's technique was specifically this, that by controlling the hue, I can make decisions about this image. I can change the saturation of the image. Let's get back to this, one sec. That by doing this, I can change the way the image looks. So let's say, for giggles, this is what I wanted the image to be. That's what the color would look like to produce that image. So again, getting back to the point, do we ever do we see in black and white? No, we see in color. We make decisions about our black and white image based off the color of the image. Bob asks, in order to use the Epson software, does the image have to be flattened first? No. The only thing that Epson Print Layout doesn't do right now is it doesn't print PSBs, the large document file format, but it prints layered TIFFs and PSDs, Photoshop documents. I tend to, in my workflow, all of my printing documents are PSDs. All of my working documents are PSBs, B as in boy, large format, and my intermediary documents are TIFFs, so that I know what it is based off of how the files are, and that I can have paper-specific and image-specific adjustments, and I save those as PSDs. So whenever I see a PSD, I know it's a printing file. If I see it a PSB, it means that it's a layered file, like this file here would be a PSB. Stephen asks, for your color landscape prints, what is your current favorite paper? And same question for black and white. I have two papers that I like to print on for color, cold pressed natural and legacy etching, depending on what it is that I want the image to do, whether I want a warmer tone in the paper base or a more brilliant white will determine which of those two. With regard to my black and whites, 100% of my black and whites are printed on legacy platine. That is probably the most amazing paper I've ever printed on, and some of my color gets printed on that too. So I'm down to those three papers. What settings do you use for your monitor calibration? Richard asks. That's a broad question. I use an X-Rite I1 display for my monitors. All my monitors have one on it because it also measures ambient light. You can go in and adjust everything, or you can let the software do the calibration for you. Since I use a BenQ monitor, as well as a Wacom Cintiq, for the BenQ monitor, I use the software that was developed by X-Rite for BenQ to be able to calibrate the monitor. So I use the software that's provided, and I allow the calibration device to determine what are the most appropriate settings. I hope that answers your question, Richard. If not, if you have any questions, any of you all, that need to be answered, my email address is vincent@versacephotography.com, and I'm more than happy to answer your emails. If I don't get back to you within a week, do me a favor, resend the email, because either I've asked somebody to answer the question and haven't gotten the answer back, or I'm out of the country and I didn't see it. But you're not bugging me by sending me multiple emails until I answer your question. You're helping me out. Jean-Pierre asks, where can I learn the multi-layer sharpening technique? Sometime this year it will be a tutorial that I will be doing on Acme Educational. There's an older version of it, but I don't want to sell that because I know that something new is coming up. Any other questions? Of course. Hello from DC. Okay, DC. How do you integrate PSD with Epson Print Layout software? Photoshop documents automatically are seen by Epson Print Layout. You just drag it to the lower portion right here, and then it will show up. Let's do that. Let's go open up a file that's a PS. See if I have one handy. Of course not. All you do basically, and this works for TIFF and PSD, is you take this file and you drag it right here, and what will happen is it will load it. And right now I have this set for black and white, so let's go to color settings, which is I want color, and then I can make decisions based here. I can select what profiles that I want, what types of papers that I want, use ICC profile, which will open up the printer. Epson Print Layout will automatically find the appropriate ICC profile for whatever paper it is that I've set. If I have a custom profile, what I can then do is come in here and pick that custom profile, and then it will load it, and I can create a preset with all of those profiles. So what I have on my main computer, we're working on my laptop right at the moment, is I have presets for Legacy Platine, presets for Legacy Platine black and white, for color, and all of that set up so that I have it set up for size, set up for color, and I'm good to go. And that's the beauty of this software. It makes it so that it's relatively drag and drop and pull down menu. Let me get back to questions. Uh-oh. Here we go. What is the name of the software used to show the color percentages of the images superimposed over the color space graph at the beginning of the webinar? That's called ColorThink. And ColorThink is an incredible software to use for analyzing pictures. I use it all the time to be able to see what's going on in the color and what profiles I should use and what decisions I should make based off of where the color goes. So highly recommend that you consider that. The Epson Print Layout, will it work with Canson ICC or only Epson papers? No, the Epson Print Layout will work with any ICC profile. It works with the newer printers. I can't speak to the older printers because it was designed to work with the newer printers, but it would be something that I would try if you have an older printer. But an ICC profile is an ICC profile. The key there would be determining which one of the different paper types matches up with the particular third-party paper that you would choose to use. I believe, though I can't speak with authority on this, but I do believe that the third-party paper manufacturers will tell you what is the best layout or best paper type to use for the profile that they built. What Epson printers does the Epson Print Layout software work with? It works with the 5000, the 900, the 7000, or the 5000, the 7000, the 9000, the 800, the 600, and it also works, from my experience, with the 9900 series printers because that's what I used for the beta. I would consider seeing if it would work with your printers by just simply downloading it. If it works, that's great. If it doesn't work, oh well. But because it's free. But it was designed to work with the current generation printers and one generation back. And it is the best way to print. I do 100% of my printing through Print Layout. Any other questions? Again, if you need to get a hold of me, my email address is vincent@versacephotography.com, and I will be more than happy to answer any questions. So thank you very much for your time, and till next time.